Yes, hello, and thank you for joining the ECogS Seminars. Today we are very happy to welcome two speakers. I'm gonna introduce the first speaker. The first speaker is Christian Schütz. Christian is a professor of psychiatry in the Institute of Mental Health in Canada. He's trained in medicine, in humanities, in public health. He has many titles. He has further completed a Fogarty Fellowship at NIDA, NIH, and DISCA DISCA Fellowship at Yale University. He has published around 160 peer-reviewed articles and more than a dozen book chapters. So he works clinically at Redfish Healing Center and conducts research on treatment infrastructure, clinical interventions, and neurobiological mechanism underlying diagnostic mechanisms such as cognitive control. Today, Christian gonna share us his work in human research and human clinical practice. Christian, thank you for joining us today. Please take it away.
Okay, let me see if I can have my slides. Can you see my slide? Or did I not?
Yes, but it's
yes.
with the slides and it's not, maybe you don't want this. Yes, now it's perfect. Yes.
Okay. So thank you very much for the introduction. I actually will try to present something which is a little bit out of my comfort zone. So I'm trying a little bit to see if I can connect what I'm doing to some degree with the work you are doing. Title is Red Park, Pubs, and Redfish, Trying to Make Sense. I do have relationships with potential conflict of interest, but I don't think any of them are relevant for the presentation I'm giving. I first want to talk about Red Park, starting out with animal research. Then I will kind of move on to human research, and Redfish Healing Center is the clinical application. In the 70s, Bruce Alexander, actually here in Vancouver, did a number of studies which became known as the Red Park studies, red, not red, with rat, R-A-T. And what he demonstrated was that animals who grew up in a socially enriched environment actually were less likely to use substances and become addicted. Let me see. Yeah, he compared that to the other studies, which are generally done in animals which were single cage housed and who became addicted quite fast compared to the rats from the Red Park. But these rats really had no social contacts, and they lived under situations which were actually quite distressing to the rat. This is what the Red Park actually looked like. Recently, this work has been picked up again by a group at NIDA, and they published a few publications where they actually showed that animals would choose socialization over drug reward if they were given the choice. What you can see here is just a summary of if the rat could choose to have contact with another rat or use drugs. They generally, and in most cases, they would choose the other animal, and actually they would choose to use a drug quite rarely. So this has led to the concept that actually marginalization induces substance abuse and addiction, and that maybe using companionship and social activities could help to reduce the risk of substance use and substance use disorder. But the problem is that the data are not really supporting that. If you look, for example, people who are going to sports clubs, who are doing sports, they are actually at higher risk of becoming alcohol dependents than those who are not going to sport clubs. Also, we know that substance use can be, and most of the time, is really a social activity. So it's not really that people are isolated and then pick up substance use, but actually normally substance use is picked up in companionship with other people, and it's picked up often at the early age, early adolescence, or late adolescence, and then is kind of like becoming more central or more important during adulthood, or maybe less important. One thing I remember when I started to work in psychiatry and I was entering our hospital, we did have a cafeteria where I had to pass. And my supervisor at that time told me, you can immediately see our patients. They're the one who are socializing together over in the cafeteria. So actually, socializing with others was a characteristic of individuals who had substance use disorder compared to individuals with other mental disorders. If I look at the time frame when individuals develop substance use disorder, develop substance use, and develop also other mental health problems, it's actually mainly during adolescence. It's early on that ADHD and anxiety, which is more like childhood, late childhood, then mood disorder and schizophrenia more during adolescence, and actually substance use falls around the same time. So all these different mental disorders, and I consider substance use disorder as one of the disorders, develop around the time of adolescence. When you look at the etiological factors, such as genetics, such as environmental factors, there's actually a huge overlap between different mental disorders. And that has recently become even more prominent, that there is not only the same time, but there's some general factors which contribute to all of the different disorders. And this is actually a study looking at the meta-analysis of neuroimaging studies. And what you can see is there is a common substrate of all psychiatric disorders. And this is this is actually looking at voxel-based studies, which is like the size of different brain areas. But what independent of the specifics of the neuroimaging, what it shows is that there are some areas which seem to be important for all mental disorders, including substance use disorders. And if you look at the areas, it's actually the insular area and the anterior cingulate. And when you look at the areas, what do they stand for? What people say this area associated with? So they are associated actually with salience network, and salience is related to sense making. It's associated with cognitive control, and cognitive control is associated with decision-making, included effort-based decision-making, and it's also associated the same regions which are important for the integration of conflicting motivations. As you can see, these are areas which seem to be important and central, not only in these disorders, but in our interaction with the environment overall. When you look at the different, move this over here. Okay, sorry. When you look at the development, what you can see is that for the psychiatric disorder here, it's lined up that executive functioning, salience, and habits are important areas. And you have development from childhood to adolescent to adulthood. And what you can see here is that executive function might be associated more with decision-making, while the habit is kind of like a different form of decision-making. And salience is the sense-making part of that. So, let's see, sorry. Okay, let me start with a quote by a German philosopher who says, "A quiet habit deprives good action of their moral value because it undermines mental freedom and moreover, sorry, I'm tired. It leads to thoughtless repetition of the same acts and thus become ridiculous." Obviously, Immanuel Kant does not think very highly about habit, and he really focuses on the conscious decision-making as the important area where humans should focus on and which are important for moral decision making. So really what he translating it to the contrast between executive function and habits would say mental freedom as determined by the executive function is more important than the habits which are thoughtless repetition. More recently, there have been actually some changes in this thinking. For example, this group of Wagner-Nordhoff, they came up with the idea of identity shaping habits having an important role, but still they would say habits lack conscious deliberation, they are unreflective, undeliberate, but habits relieve us of the cognitive burden of having to re-educate conclusions reached by reasons and reflections. It's the same dichotomy, but now it's actually the idea that the habits might have an impact, and that's actually once, so to say, the reasons and the deliberate decision makings have come to a conclusion, you over time can then sink that conclusion into the unconscious part so that you can free up the conscious part for new deliberation. So that is some development, but more recently, actually, there is a publication by Susanna and Tom, who use the embodied, embedded, extended, and an active cognitive approach. And they defined habit as an adaptive, precarious, and self-sustaining network of interactive processes that generate dynamical sensomotor patterns. Habits are essential constituents of the self or self-agency. So that's an important progress, an important change in the perception of what habit constitutes. So I tried to visualize that to some degree, in that as a child, you interact with a very kind of restricted environment. Let's assume the black dots are the family, so you're mainly within the family. And as you grow older, you actually become more involved with other people and outside of your family, specifically your peers. And then you kind of like ascend or change into adulthood. To show that again, this is actually more of an idea of age and environment coupling, being at different stages in the development and being associated with different environment and different also kind of like variety and different area of the environment. This is inspired mainly by Hanne de Jager's participatory sense-making. And what I'm envisioning is that while people here move as adolescent out of the family and become more interactive with peers and other families, and then as an adult, they actually live in the community, often relatively independent from their family, and have way more interactions than they did have originally as a child. What does it mean? It means actually you can extend the habit, and I think it is included in the idea, but that the interactive process obviously also are interacting with other individuals and groups, and that the developed sensomotor patterns include also interaction with others. While I was kind of like trying to apply these ideas to the clinical work, I stumbled upon two problems, which I will more or less just kind of indicate or name, and which I have a suggestion, which I don't really know if they make sense or not. One is, I think it's important to see that habits can be very simple or very complex. And I think the complexity of habits and habit network is important. And having a background as a philologist, I was thinking that actually maybe something like language could be an example of an integrated habitual and deliberate interaction. as when you deal with language, you can have like 3 different levels. There are more different levels in some contexts, but very simple. One is the syntax, the semantics, and the pragmatics. And the syntax simply means that you are constructing utterances in a certain way, that you have words and you have sentences and you put them together in one language different from another language. And then you have semantics, which is the sense making, the intentionality, which is associated with these utterances, habitual utterances. And then you have pragmatics, which show that you can change, the meaning can change, and they're context specific and also goal specific. So I think we need to develop better models in understanding the integration of habitual and deliberate interactions. And I think the complexity changes these interactions, and the level of complexity is important because a lot of the habits we have are kind of like compiled from different habits, and you can have some flexibility in how to compile them. The second aspect which I wanted to touch upon, and which I think is an aspect worthwhile discussing, is the aspect of intrinsic motivation or effectance motivation. What is happening is actually when we are talking about gamification and looking at, for example, internet game dependence or addiction, what is interesting is that games really get people motivated to continue to play. And the reward you're getting is not really that large, or that something which is really that helpful in your life. So why are these games so addictive, or why we are spending so much time with the games? And I think one thing is that there is something like an intrinsic motivation. We are learning for its own sake to some degree. We have curiosity. We like to play games, try out new things. We actually do competitive sports, even though we don't need to do them. And the reward is often very simple, like getting a ball into a certain space. But I think there is something about these effects which are different from the extrinsic motivation, and which recently seems to get a little bit of attention, but so far has had very little attention. Ryan and Deci, I hope I don't mispronounce the name, have worked on that topic to some degree, and they have the definition that they propose that intrinsic motivation is a lifelong psychological growth function that is based in the basic needs for competence and autonomy. And then they define competence and autonomy. And I think that is an aspect which so far has gotten little attention, and trying to start to work on gamification of treatment, I think this is an important aspect which we need to understand. Interestingly enough, the few little studies which have been done on intrinsic motivation actually indicate that the same aspect of the brain, which I said before, were kind of like very important for defining the brain-associated aspects of mental disorders, seem to be overlapping with the areas, and they seem to be overlapping with extrinsic motivation areas. I tried to keep it short, I think at 20 minutes, and I hope I didn't go over. In summary, this presentation summarizes some questions which, from my perspective as clinicians, may be worthwhile to be explored in order to understand substance use disorder and addiction. Important aspects of substance use disorder and addiction may be defined as substance use disorder and addictions being pathological, complex, identity-shaping habits, generally developing within the context of transitioning into adulthood, which is a time when you acquire the identity shaping habits which form your adult life. Aside from focusing on the individual propensity concerning drug effects, it suggests that rehabituation of interaction with environments, including other individuals, appear to be essential for sustainable changes. Thank you very much for the attention. I assume that I can take questions.
Thank you very much.